What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have the number 5 ranked lightweight, Islam Makhachev, 20 wins and 1 loss, taking on the number 6 ranked lightweight, Dan Hooker, 21 wins and 10 losses. Now, I want to start with just the overall narrative and sentiment, and really one of the first observations I made shortly after the fight was announced and agreed upon. I was thinking, travel, where are they going to host the fight, and basically how is Dan Hooker, who's from the same region, New Zealand, as Israel Adesanya, who can't get the flight arrangements scheduled in a way where he could even compete in the last quarter of 2021. So I'm thinking, okay, how's Hooker going to arrange this? And so he has relocated to Las Vegas, and he is not training actively with City Kickboxing out of New Zealand, but one of his wrestling coaches happened to be training at Syndicate in Las Vegas. So Dan Hooker has been training with them and has been preparing for this fight with, again, the number 5 ranked Islam Makhachev. But what I was looking into, besides, the logistics of the whole thing, was how sold is the public on the rise of Islam Makhachev? Because, you can't help but associate him with Khabib Nurmagomedov. They're both from the same region of Dagestan, Russia. They trained together when Khabib was making his exit from the UFC as lightweight champ, undefeated lightweight champ. Khabib basically declared that the next best at lightweight is Islam Makhachev. Now, it's no surprise that he would make that, being that they are teammates and they support one another and so forth. But because of the style of fight, and also they just happen to have the same exact hairline, haircut with the same beard. And I get that some of these things are just overall cultural looks, but even beyond that, not that they have the same facial features, but they do somewhat resemble. People are going to make the association. Now, there are differences with how they wrestle, some of the techniques and some of their respective skill sets. There are some notable differences, but their opponents just seem to find themselves in similarly helpless positions. And that is at the center of the parallels that people draw between Islam Makhachev and Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, Islam obviously hasn't fought nearly the level of competition over time as Khabib did, but Khabib, only really had that last few years where he was truly fighting one elite guy after another. So Islam was on a similar trajectory, but then he caught COVID in 2020, so he was actually out for more than a year. His very impressive decision win over Davi Ramos, a very good grappler himself, different styles, more of a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, but a very dangerous grappler. Islam Makhachev beat him and then wasn't in the cage for the next year and a half. And then he fought Drew Dober, where, he just had one of those upper body, lay your opponent flat on the back and then be able to secure an arm triangle from the top, basically using your leverage and the torque in your upper body, and basically boa constricted Drew Dober with that choke. A very impressive win. So yes, fight after fight, Islam Makhachev is looking very dangerous, very scary, and it seems like opponents are trying to find ways to, try to keep it, in the stand-up. Keep yourself from getting caught in these positions where he's clearly more adept at positioning you exactly where he wants you to either beat on you or to submit you. So Islam has, understandably been on this rise, but the guy, when you look at the betting odds, and this was one of the things that I took the biggest issue with, is the fact that he's a greater than 4-1 favorite against Dan Hooker, who, just over a year ago was knocking on the door to a title shot. Dan Hooker, a few years ago, he knocked out Gilbert Burns, and that's, so much has happened and people have changed weight classes, Gilbert Burns in particular, since, where some of those wins are kind of like, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson knocking out Robert Whittaker before Whittaker went up to middleweight. So people don't really mention the Gilbert Burns knockout for Dan Hooker as one of the things to look to get an indication of where he is today. But let's not act like during the pandemic he didn't just have a fight of the year contender against Dustin Poirier, the guy who's about to fight for the title and who by all means has been the uncrowned champion for the last year. Basically been on a run since his title challenge loss to Khabib. I'm talking Dustin Poirier. His first fight back was a classic against Dan Hooker, where through 4 rounds, you had no idea how this fight was being scored. It was really in the balance between Poirier and Dan Hooker. I mean, they hurt the hell out of each other, and it was just one of those back and forth, brutal battle of attritions. And again, that was like the difference between Poirier getting this great opportunity and Dan Hooker having to kind of go, back at the line. And his next fight would be against Michael Chandler, which resulted in a knockout loss for Hooker. So that, as much as how impressive Islam's been looking in his last several fights, are the reasons why the betting odds are so skewed in favor of Islam. But it really makes no sense. Like 4-1 with a fight that should really be looked at as nearly even. It's a very unusually weird betting line. And look, the fight might go down and it might turn out, yeah, they were right. Islam Makhachev just ragdolls Dan Hooker, submits him. Dan Hooker looked just as helpless as the rest of them. I'm just saying that is a very presumptuous position to take on Dan Hooker, who, aside from that knockout to Michael Chandler, where Michael Chandler being a shorter fighter, much shorter than Islam Makhachev, who's 5'10", Dan Hooker's unusually tall for the division. He's like 6 feet. He basically has a similar advantage in this division as Corey Sandhagen has at bantamweight. Or if you look at when Nate Diaz, before he started just fighting at 170, like from the time he fought Conor onward, Nate's been operating at 170, but he's really been a true 155 guy. Think back at the height advantage that Nate Diaz had before the Conor McGregor fight when he was operating at 155. That is the type of advantage that Dan Hooker has. Plus, Dan Hooker has a 75-inch reach. But in that case where Dan Hooker got knocked out against Chandler, he was fighting against a much shorter Chandler who invested to the body with hard shots early to then set Hooker up to look low and then go high, because you've got him basically spooked because he doesn't want to take another hard shot to the body like the last ones you've been giving him. So he caught Hooker in one of those scenarios. And I mean, that just happens sometimes. It's a very good technique when applied correctly. In boxing, Canelo Alvarez did it brilliantly against Amir Khan. Invest to the body, get them to think low, and go high. But aside from that knockout to Chandler, you'd have to go back to December of 2018 when he fought Edson Barboza. When Hooker fought Barboza, he got finished basically with a punch to the body. Aside from those two, knockout losses, he's about as durable as they come in the more gritty fights. So, and plus he has 5-round experience. He's got multiple fights that have gone the 5-round distance. So I'm just looking at the betting line and I'm saying that is not an accurate reflection of how this fight should be handicapped. And again, I could be totally wrong once they go into the cage. But look, I was nearly looking at picking Dan Hooker, and I'm still kind of considering that possibility, especially because this is a 3-rounder, not a 5-rounder. So Hooker doesn't have to find a way of surviving 25 minutes without getting ragdolled by Makhachev. He has to outpoint or finish, but outpoint Makhachev in 15 minutes. And I do think he's got a very good chance at stealing the first round because of his kickboxing ability and his dangerous and dynamic striking and his use of range and reach. Islam Makhachev, he's improving in his stand-up skills for sure, but he doesn't have the most technical of head movement, for instance. So I'm looking at Hooker to kind of get out to an early lead and for Islam to either spook him with the body, because this is also possible. Islam can spook Hooker to the body or threaten a takedown and end up catching him, clocking him up top. That is possible because Islam himself has knocked people out. He knocked out Gleason Tebow just like 3 years ago. So that is possible, but I think that Hooker's going to be the one to get off to an early start, an early lead, possibly stealing the first round. And the fact that this is a 3-rounder, you really have to consider Hooker via decision. But just before I would go and actually pick Hooker, even though the betting lines make it, appetizing and attractive, I might consider that. But what is making me think that maybe in this prediction video I'm going to lean Islam Makhachev is because of 2 consecutive fights that Dan Hooker had. And they weren't the knockout loss to Michael Chandler. They were actually his fight against Paul Felder, followed by that classic against Dustin Poirier. And those I was looking at as being so troublesome because, just before that, Dan Hooker was fighting Al Iaquinta, who had just, recently challenged Khabib for the vacant lightweight title. Al Iaquinta was looking pretty damn good. He had just beaten Kevin Lee, but then he had, lost to Donald Cowboy Cerrone in a very grueling fight. That was a really rough one. In fact, in hindsight, I remember Al Iaquinta commenting on the Cerrone fight, which went the entire 5 rounds, and he was talking about how rough the recovery was from that fight. Well, after that fight for Iaquinta, he basically got dominated, dropped multiple times by Dan Hooker, hurt big time with leg kicks, just leg kicks, near calf kicks. His legs were damaged to where he was switching stances when he really had no business in that case, switching stances. It was just let me get this league leg the hell out of the way. But it was that win that Hooker was coming off when he then got into the cage with Paul Felder and won a 5-round decision, split decision, very close fight, could have gone either way. But I looked at that one and, I kind of took a couple points away in my mental, assessment of Hooker in terms of his sweet science stand-up ability. I knew that he was a dynamic striker. I just thought he was a little bit better at hitting and not getting hit so much before I saw him get in there with Paul Felder. When he went in there with Paul Felder, they just went to war. It was so close, and you're in there, and they weren't, looking to take each other down throughout the duration of the fight. So it was just a lot of spit flying back and forth between Hooker and Paul Felder, and then you couple that with the subsequent fight against Dustin Poirier, which again, it was razor close in a fight of the year contender. You don't want to get in too many fight of the year contenders in your MMA career. Those are not good for your health. But those were the 2 fights that when I'm looking at Dan Hooker, I'm saying, has he ever, did he retain all of the reflexes, freshness, energy, abilities after those 2 fights that he had coming into the first of those 2 fights? I don't think that the answer is yes. And so that's what makes me think, okay, if we were dealing with the same Hooker that fought Al Iaquinta or James Vick before that, I would have to really consider putting him as a greater than 50% chance at beating Islam Makhachev and then, picking Dan Hooker to win. But because of those 2 fights, and then, obviously there was the knockout to Chandler after that, I still think that he's got a much better chance than I think people are giving him credit for. Islam's been stopped. It was a long time ago. It was when he had, basically his second fight in the UFC back in 2015. He had gotten knocked out by Adriano Martins. Some of y'all might remember him. But that was like 6 years ago. But I'm saying that it is possible. And it is very interesting that the betting odds and the public basically are not giving Dan Hooker a good shot at winning this. Again, he was just like knocking on the door, top 3, top 4 contender where you're like 1 win away from being like next in line for the title. But I'm going to go Islam Makhachev. But since I'm picking Hooker to probably win the first round, I think that it's going to be like a split decision, 2 rounds to 1 type of win for Islam Makhachev. This is a big step up. And I know that he looks sensational against Drew Dober. He's fought good people in the past. Nick Lentz is pretty good. His last opponent, Thiago Moises, is pretty good. Ranked, 10 to 15-ish in the division. But I'm going to go with Islam Makhachev via close decision where there might even be some banter about who should have really won that fight. One of those kinds of fights. But yeah, let me know what you think about this number 5 rank versus number 6 rank lightweight fight. Look, Islam's obviously on a fast track to the title, and Dan Hooker to some is looking like a necessary step up rung of the ladder that Islam's going to pass on his way to contending for the title. But look, I would not be surprised if Hooker turns this one the other way. I think he's got the ability. I think he still has the desire. I don't think he would have made these traveler rate. He's getting paid to do it. So there is that. I think that Hooker thinks that he could win. I think he might get discouraged somewhere in the second round. If not the second round, then if he gets taken down in the third round after losing one of the first 2 rounds, then he might realize he might lose the will to get out of a compromising position that Islam might have him in to control the rest of the round. So yeah, I'm taking Islam via decision. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.